On October 18, 1917, Austin and Sophia Snow received a telegram. Their son, Private Charles Snow of the Newfoundland Regiment, had died as a prisoner of war in France. Before he joined the regiment, Charles was a fisherman. He worked in his father's boat and he used his earnings to help support his parents. Charles's death plunged his parents into mourning, but it also left them in dire financial straits. Amid the heartbreak of losing a son, Snow's mother also had to apply to the government for the separation allowance it gave to soldiers' dependents. The Snows were a fishing family, but Sophia explained in the forms that her husband's deteriorating physical condition prevented him from making a decent living. He has been partly crippled all his life, she wrote. Without their son's help in the family fishery, they could not make ends meet, and they still had a daughter to support. The paymaster rejected her application.
Referring to your application for separation allowance, I have been directed to inform you that same cannot be granted because your husband is not incapacitated and consequently you cannot be considered to be totally dependent upon your son.
The war had robbed Austin and Sophia Snow of their son. Now it also stole the financial support he would have given them in their later years. The Snows were not alone. Other families were experiencing similar hardships. John Fitzgerald was shot dead while binding another man's wounds on the battlefield at Gallipoli on December 1, 1915. The government praised his selfless act of bravery, but refused his mother's request for separation allowance.
Dear Madam, referring to your application for separation allowance, I have been directed to inform you that same cannot be granted, because at the time your son John was serving in the regiment, you had another single son of military age who did not offer for enlistment, and the regulations provide that where there are two single sons, allowance will not be made until the second son enlists, and the reason given for non-enlistment of your second son is not considered sufficient to grant you the allowance.
Mary Fitzgerald was a widow living in St. John's. Her other son was in Pittsburgh. It is estimated that between 1,600 and 2,000 Newfoundlanders and Labradorians were killed in the war. Each one of those deaths had devastating consequences for their loved ones at home. Some children grew up fatherless, like Harry White of Durrell's Arm. In 1922, the 6-year-old donated $1 to the building of the Beaumont Hamel Memorial. That was the spot where my father was killed, Harry wrote. Harry never had the chance to meet his father, who had enlisted a few months before his son was born. John Curley also died at Beaumont Hamel. His wife, Elizabeth, was left alone to raise their 4 children. The only money she ever received from the government was the remainder of John's army pay. Some of the soldiers who enlisted never had the chance to start their own families. William Morgan was just 16 years old when he died at Beaumont Hamel on July 1, 1916. He was one of the approximately 272 underaged soldiers who are believed to have died in the war while serving with the Newfoundland Regiment. Sometimes the effects of a soldier's injury or death went far beyond his immediate family. On October 11, 1916, Lieutenant Stephen Norris was killed in action at Goudecourt in France. His parents owned a fish canning plant at 3 Arms in Green Bay. The business was the economic backbone of the small community. Norris's death left it without an heir. After his father died in 1924, the cannery closed and the community withered away. By 1945, only 2 families lived there. Today it no longer exists. The death of officers like Norris often had far-reaching effects on the Dominion's post-war development because they were usually the sons of the Dominion's social, economic, and political elite. Men who quite likely would have become business or political leaders. Only one of the 5 regiment officers shown in this photograph survived the war. The other 4 were killed in action. On July 1, 1916, 4 members of the Eyre family were killed at Beaumont Hamel. The heirs were a prominent family in Newfoundland and Labrador. They were businessmen, lawyers, politicians. The men and women who served in the war have been called Newfoundland and Labrador's lost generation. The lost includes those who died, but it also refers to those who returned home forever changed by the physical and psychological wounds that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Men who came home with lost legs or arms could no longer fish, a serious blow in a dominion where the family-based cod fishery was the pillar of the local economy. That happened to George Gilbert Baker of Trinity Bay. A gunshot wound to the right leg sent him to hospital on November 20th, 1917. His wounds were so bad that the leg had to be amputated. Before the war, Baker was a fisherman, but his injuries ended that. On May 15th, 1921, he sent a letter to the government stating that he could no longer work for his livelihood and he was finding it hard to make ends meet on his soldier's pension. Post-traumatic stress disorder also made it impossible for many more people to hold down steady work or to reintegrate into society. At the time, the condition was known as shell shock. It affected a significant number of the men who returned home. It also scarred many of the women who worked overseas as nurses and who saw death and suffering every single day. Part of a generation of potential leaders was now lost to Newfoundland and Labrador. It is impossible to measure the ways that this loss affected the Dominion. What we do know is that the post-war years were a time of tremendous political and economic turbulence. Scandal plagued the political scene for decades. Between 1919 and 1925, 6 different administrations governed the Dominion. The people became increasingly disillusioned with local politics and local politicians. Part of this was due to the tangle of red tape surrounding soldier pensions and separation allowances. Some people accused the government of breaking faith with the men and women it had sent overseas and with their families. Tensions were inflamed in 1932 when allegations of corruption and fraud surfaced against Prime Minister Sir Richard Squires. He was accused of misusing public funds, including money from the War Reparations Committee. The allegations sparked widespread public rage. On April 5, 1932, 10,000 people rioted outside the Colonial Building. The mob broke windows, raided the building, and looted government offices. Squires escaped unharmed under a police escort, but his political career was ruined. The House of Assembly dissolved and an election was called for June. Newfoundland also experienced significant financial problems. It had entered the war already in debt because of the building of a trans-island railway. Then it spent millions more on war loans, on interest payments on those loans, and on soldier pensions. A global economic recession in the 1920s made it impossible to rebound. By the time the worldwide Great Depression broke out in 1929, Newfoundland's public debt was so large that interest payments alone devoured more than 40% of the annual income. The situation was unsustainable, and Newfoundland turned to Britain for help. But Britain had itself been heavily burdened by the cost of the war. Its assistance would come at a price. Britain wanted greater political control over Newfoundland to ensure that the Dominion's funds were managed frugally. The Dominion would have to replace its elected government with one that was appointed by Britain. The new Commission of Government was sworn in on February 16, 1934. It remained in power until Newfoundland and Labrador joined Canada in 1949. The human and fiscal costs of the war were likely among the contributing factors that led to Newfoundland's crisis in the 1920s and 1930s. Although impossible to know, many people today wonder how Newfoundland and Labrador's history may have been different if it hadn't lost about 1,600 people in the war, or if thousands more hadn't returned home injured.